Narrated by Terry Schnaubelt. Chapter 1. "Well, aren't you a pretty little thing?" Laura froze. The sounds of the fair were drowned out by the roar in her ears. It was already warm and promised to be a hot day, but she was suddenly chilled and a little girl again.
"Daddy, I'm scared."
One of her earliest memories was sitting in one of the cars on the Ferris wheel as it rocked lazily back and forth. The wheel had stopped with their car at the very top, and all of Fresno and the surrounding areas spread out from the fairgrounds, the lights of thousands of homes and businesses twinkling in the night. She clung to her father, squealing with equal amounts of horror and glee each time she peeked out over the edge of the car to look down on all the people. It only took a few seconds before she buried her face against her father's shirt, the fabric fisted in both small hands. His arm around her made her feel safe in a way that not even the belt around her waist and the safety bar locked over their laps could. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, much too short for the ride. How had her father convinced the operator to let her on? It wasn't too hard to figure out. Laura's father was persuasive and used to getting his way, in his business, in stores, in restaurants, in his home. One thing he always wanted was whatever would make her happy. Nothing was too good for his only daughter. He made sure she had the best clothes, the best toys, and the best education. If she had pointed her chubby hand at the monstrous ride and said, "Ride, please, Daddy," he would have done whatever it took to get her on. She didn't know if he had taken her to the fair that first year after her birth, but certainly by the following year he had begun what would be a yearly tradition. Although he hadn't lived in Fresno for years before she was born, he had fond memories of the fair from his own childhood. He had been raised there in the days when Fresno was a rural agricultural town. Going to the fair was one of the few luxuries his parents had managed to afford. Taking her back to his hometown every year became a ritual that nothing was allowed to disrupt. From the beginning, it was a father-daughter-only trip. Laura's mother was neither invited nor did she seem interested. They always went the first day the fair opened, arriving at the gate before it opened and staying until well after dark. She slept in the back seat as he drove home, but even so, she was always tired and cranky the next morning. When she was old enough for school, she was allowed to stay home and rest. No matter what was happening at work, the opening day of the fair was theirs. It continued every year, even after she entered her teens and her father was the last person she wanted to go to the fair or anywhere else with. But he insisted, and he always got his way. The last time she went to the fair with him was 9 years earlier, the year she was 25. She was engaged to be married in 6 months, and she decided that it was juvenile for a married woman to continue going to the fair with her father. Laura watched the Ferris wheel, remembering. She remembered the exhilaration of rising in the air, the way her stomach did flip-flops as they descended. Most of all, she remembered being 3 years old. She remembered thinking her father was the biggest, strongest, bravest man in the world. She remembered that feeling of assurance that nothing could hurt her as long as he was holding her. She looked over at him now. It was the first day of the fair, and she was there once again with her father. He didn't look big, or strong, or particularly brave. Today, he just seemed lost. His hair was white. He didn't stand as straight as she remembered from her childhood. He certainly didn't exude the confidence and authority that had always convinced everyone from powerful CEOs to Ferris wheel operators to accede to his wishes. "Daddy, do you remember taking me on the Ferris wheel?" He smiled at her. "I think there's time for 9 holes before that meeting." "Dad, we aren't at the golf course. We're at the fair, remember? The Fresno Fair. You and I used to come every year." "I just need to pick up my clubs." He ambled away, and Laura followed a few feet behind, watching him stop to bend down and pick up an imaginary tee. The exhaustion of the last 2 years suddenly settled over her, along with the familiar resentment of having put her life on hold. The life that had fallen apart. As they neared the exhibit halls, she caught up to him. "Dad, do you want something to eat?" "We have a foursome, and it's too beautiful a day to waste indoors." "You don't even know who I am, do you?" she sighed. He patted her hand where it rested on his arm. "Well, aren't you a pretty little thing?" Laura released his arm as he knelt to put the imaginary tea in the dirt. Reaching into her purse, she ripped a piece of paper from her notebook and located a pen. She quickly wrote on the paper, and when he stood up, she folded the paper and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt. "The boys want to meet in the bar for drinks before we start," he told her. "The clubhouse is right over there," she replied, pointing to the Home Arts building just across the grass. He smiled and headed in that direction. She watched him, knowing that within a few steps he had already forgotten where he was going. The tide of people broke around her as she stood, feeling her heart pound in her chest. He followed the crowd of people moving toward the building. He stepped through the large open doors and into the shade. The crowd closed around him, and then her father disappeared from her sight. Still, she stood there, her eyes watching the doorway. For 5 minutes she waited, and then she pulled the strap of her purse onto her shoulder and began walking away from the building. She walked to a different gate from the one they had entered less than an hour earlier. Refusing a stamp on her wrist that would allow her to re-enter the fairgrounds later, she slipped through the exit. She walked to the parking lot where she had parked her car. Sliding behind the wheel, she started the car and turned the air conditioning on. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the steering wheel for several moments. Finally, she backed out of the parking space and pulled onto Chance Avenue. She made her way slowly through the busy streets until she found the entrance to Highway 41. Merging into the southbound lanes, Laura drove away from Fresno, away from her memories. "Well, aren't you a pretty little thing?" Chapter 2. It was the 5th or 6th time that the man passed by before Steve Jacobs, CEO of the Fresno City Fairgrounds, took notice of him. He was not tall, several inches shorter than Steve's 6 feet, thin, white-haired. Steve tried to remember how long ago it was that he first saw him. Several hours at least. The man didn't seem to be with anyone, nor did he seem to have a destination in mind, and Steve had seen him in several different areas as he made his rounds. There was nothing unusual about that. A lot of people came to the fair just to walk aimlessly around and look at the sights. Except the man wasn't looking at them. He didn't seem to even notice the rides with screaming teenagers or the hawkers trying to lure him to play a game. Steve watched as the man approached a young couple and said something. The boy and girl gave him a wary look and glanced at one another. He could see them shaking their heads as they moved away, and then heard their mocking laughter once they were well away from the man. He thought back and couldn't remember having previously seen the man with food or anything to drink. September's San Joaquin Valley sun beat down mercilessly, making it unwise to go too long without fluids. Could this be a homeless man panhandling? It was possible. Security guards and the police tried to keep them out, but occasionally someone slipped inside. Steve began to surreptitiously follow the elderly man. His face was red and his breathing labored, yet his expression was pleasant with an absent-minded smile. The man again approached someone, this time a frazzled-looking mother with 3 small children in tow. He couldn't hear what the man said, but he saw the woman frown at him and quickly pull her children away. He decided it was time to intervene. If the man was annoying paying customers, it was just a matter of time before someone reported him to security. Or, he thought, before some macho hothead decided to take care of him. He closed the distance between them and gently tapped the man on the shoulder. The man swung around slowly, a smile spreading across his face when he saw Steve. "Well," the man said, "it's you." Steve paused for a moment, searching his memory since the man seemed to recognize him. "Sir," he finally said, "do you need any help?" "Well," the man said, reaching out and shaking Steve's hand enthusiastically, "isn't that just?" "I'm sorry?" "Oh, sure. We have an 8 a.m. tea time, but I think we'll make it." "Tea time?" Steve glanced around at the milling throng of people, none of whom seemed aware of the strange conversation he was having with the man. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Absolutely," the man said with a chuckle. Steve waited, but the man didn't offer his name. Instead, he seemed to forget that he was having a conversation. He turned and began walking away. Steve moved to stand in front of him. "Sir, your name?" "Don't you worry, young man. I never forget to tip my caddy. Here you go." The man patted his pockets as though looking for something, and then reached into a small breast pocket and withdrew a slip of paper. Handing it to Steve, he said, "I better go catch up with my group. They can't start without me." Steve looked at the paper as he followed the man, trying to keep him in sight. Written on the paper were the words, "My name is Larry." Catching up with the man, Steve gently took his arm to get him to stop. "I'm sorry, sir. Is your name Larry?" "Well, hello there." The man shook Steve's hand again. "I haven't seen you in a stone's age. What have you been up to? How's the family?" "Larry," he tried again. "Can you tell me your last name?" "We just need one more good man to make a foursome. How about it? Are you up for it?" Steve ran a hand over his eyes and looked at the man in frustration. He noticed that not only was his face red, he was perspiring profusely and had large sweat spots on his shirt. As he began to walk away again, he wobbled a bit, and Steve worried he was about to fall. Gently taking his arm, Steve steered the man to a concession stand and bought a bottle of water. "Larry, I think you better drink this." He put the bottle to the man's mouth and tilted it. The man drank willingly enough, but when Steve tried to put the bottle in his hand, he didn't seem to know what to do with it. Sighing, Steve held the bottle to his lips again and reached for the radio hooked to his belt. "Security, this is Jacobs. Do we have any missing person reports?" "No, sir, no missing persons for today." "I'm bringing in a man who seems to be lost. We need to get an announcement out."
An adult?
"Yeah, elderly man, approximately 5'6". First name Larry." "Will do, sir." "Larry," he said, clipping the radio back on his belt. "I'd like you to come with me, okay? Let's see if we can find your people." Larry offered no objections as he accepted another drink from the cold water bottle. He meekly allowed Steve to guide him through the crowds toward the fairground security office. As they made their way slowly, stopping frequently for Steve to give Larry another drink, the announcement went out over the loudspeakers. "Attention, please. We have an elderly man who has become separated from his party. He is approximately 5'6" tall, and his first name is Larry. Anyone looking for this gentleman, please contact the security office located next to the southwest entrance gate. Thank you." Steve was relieved when he finally ushered Larry into the security office. He offered the elderly man a chair, but it took several attempts to get him to sit. Steve finally had to gently push on his shoulders until his knees bent and he lowered himself onto the chair. "What's going on, Steve?" Steve turned as Jack Padilla entered the office. Jack was head of security for the fairgrounds. "I found this guy wandering around the grounds. I'm not sure how long he's been here, but I've seen him several times over the last few hours. He's pretty confused, and he had this note in his pocket." Steve handed the note to Jack. Jack read it and handed it back to Steve, who folded it and put it back in Larry's pocket. Steve knelt and gave Larry another drink of water. "I was worried about heat exhaustion," he said. "I haven't seen him with anything to drink, and he's sweating pretty good." "He hasn't told you his last name?" "Nope, he just talks about golf." "Golf, huh? This seems kinda strange," Jack told him. "I mean, if someone put that note in his pocket to identify him in case he gets lost, then why not put his last name on it as well? His first name alone won't help locate where he belongs." Steve gave Larry another drink of water before standing up. "Think we should get one of the cops in here and file a police report?" he asked. "No," Jack said, scratching his head. "We've got the announcement going out. Let's see if anyone comes looking for him." "He's been here most of the day. Shouldn't someone have reported him missing already?" Maybe they don't know it yet. He could have been with a group that's split up. You know how that goes. One person thinks he's with the other one thinks he's with the first, and no one realizes he's missing until they meet up. Elderly man named Larry. That should get someone's attention." The sound of retching caused both men to spin around in time to see Larry vomit, slide from his chair, and crumple onto the floor. Steve rushed to the unconscious man as Jack called for the paramedics stationed at the fairgrounds. The paramedics were close by and arrived within minutes. Larry had regained consciousness, but he was lethargic and mumbling incoherently. Steve stood back and watched as they examined him, started an intravenous line for fluids, attached the leads for the heart monitor, and radioed to the hospital emergency room that they would be bringing him in. Steve gave what information he had about the man, which was little other than his name was Larry. He didn't respond to his name, but he didn't respond appropriately to anything that was said to him. "He's severely dehydrated," the paramedic told Steve and Jack, kneeling over Larry. "We need to get him to the ER." "Could the dehydration be the cause of his confusion?" Steve asked. "Could be, but there's no way to know right now whether the dehydration caused the confusion or if he was already confused, and that's why he didn't drink enough and became dehydrated." He looked up at the two men. "You haven't located any family?" "Not yet," Jack responded. If someone hears our announcements and comes looking for him, we will let them know where you are taking him." Larry was able to stand up with help, and the paramedics convinced him to lie down on the gurney. He was so weak that he didn't resist, and they soon had straps across his chest and thighs to prevent him from falling or climbing off as they wheeled him out to the waiting ambulance. "All right," Jack said as the ambulance drove away. "I guess we can't wait any longer to file a police report. If his family shows up and it was just a misunderstanding, the police can just close their case." "Yeah," Steve agreed. "But something tells me no one is going to come looking for him."